Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is October the 13th, the Friday, 2023. If it's Friday, it must be that was the week. It's been quite a week. I need to tell you what happened this week. Such a shocking week, in fact, that it even seemed to shock Keith into dropping his AI-generated art and have a more vivid and dramatic cover for his newsletter. Can we stop a more brutal world, Keith asks? At least it stopped the brutality of your AI art.
It did indeed. I couldn't even begin to think how to ask Midjourney to do this week's front cover. I was lost for prompts.
Yeah, I don't think we want Midjourney coming up with images from Gaza or northern Israel. So I don't want to spend the whole time, Keith. This is a tech show rather than a politics show, but your editorial this week focuses on politics. So very briefly, you write, so for me, it's a time to stand back and ask some big questions. What are the big questions that the events of the week have triggered in you?
I think the questions are posed by some of the people I published this week in the curated list, but it really comes down to, is the weakness of America relative to its future replacement such that the world is starting to fall apart? Ray Dalio writes a piece about that. Graham Allison, who has been a long-term advisor to US foreign policy and wrote a book called Destined for War, talks about it. And Noah Smith, in his excellent newsletter called No Opinion, also writes about the end of Pax Americana as leading to, let's think of them as mischief makers around the world, whether it's Putin or Hamas or anyone else, taking advantage of the fact that no one's going to stop them. And that this, for these writers, is the precursor to the ultimate showdown, they believe, between the US and China. And so they're predicting that these are the early skirmishes of a future global conflict.
So well, we've heard this a million times before, firstly. And secondly, I don't know what was so peaceful about the 70s or 80s, or the Pax Americana. What exactly does that mean? Wars in Korea, in Vietnam, wars in the Middle East. I just think this is hysteria to me. I don't know where any evidence. Firstly, there's no evidence that what's happening in Gaza is going to result in a war between China and America. And secondly, where is this Pax Americana? Where I don't see any evidence of that.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's some of what you say I agree with, but just to retrieve the logic out of what they're saying, it is the case that the Cold War was a Cold War, not a hot war, and despite
ask the Vietnamese or the Cambodians or the Laotians or the Koreans there. I don't think they would agree. Or many countries in Africa, Angola.
No, but I think you could be accused of losing context there, Andrew, because remember, by 1950, we're coming out of 50 years of global conflict, 2 world wars. And regional conflict and global conflict are not the same thing. They're both horrible, but they're very different. And what these guys are saying is we're moving from a period of regional conflict, which is what Pax Americana acknowledges existed, back to global conflict. Now, that is an actual point that you can engage with. And I agree with you. I mean, my editorial is all about preventing that and human agency and not wanting that to happen. But for example, that has consequences. It means America shouldn't be fighting China. It should be embracing it.
But I don't understand the connection between what's happening in Gaza and Israel and China. China's not involved in this.
Well, it's an abstraction to do with opportunity when there is a contested world stage for regional players to take actions that will not be policed by global policemen. That's the
I mean, that's the Smith thing. But I don't even understand the context there. Americans sending huge amount of support for Israel. So why is this different from the Yom Kippur War or the 6-Day War? I don't see what the difference is.
The difference is that they happened at a time of American rising global power. Whether we all pretty much didn't like it, but when America did what it did in Iran and even in Iraq post-Cold War, it was the dying embers of a strident rising America. What they're claiming in these pieces, and we can disagree.
And this is the Smith piece, and the pieces by the book by Allison, Destined for War, and Ray Dalio.
Yeah. And by the way, if you look at the subtitle of Allison's book, talking about the I can't pronounce the word.
Trap.
Yeah. What that refers to is the inevitability of a declining power having to fight to retain its position in the world. It's not about the rising power, it's about the declining power. So Great Britain would be the archetypal example in modern history where the rise of Germany and the US happened many, many decades before World War I. It took half a century for the transition of world power to play itself out very violently. And they're claiming that we're in such an era. I'm not saying I agree with it. In fact, I'm saying that they write as if it's inevitable, and I disagree with that.
Well, enough. We've done international politics, Keith. This is a tech show. We're talking with Keith Teare, the CEO of Signal Rank and the author of a wonderful weekly newsletter, which we deal with every week, called That Was the Week. Keith, how have the events played out on social media? Lots of you connect with an interesting piece from Ryan Broderick. This is what an unmoderated internet looks like. Content moderation is a failed project. Seems to me, from the small amount of time that I've spent on social media this week, is it just mimics the hysteria in the world itself. Is this week going to be remembered as the week where social media formally failed?
I think the opposite. It's the week it succeeded. Mimicking the real world is what you want it to do. The real world is full of, weirdness and things you strongly disagree with. And the idea that social media could be this haven that it isn't like that, first of all, begs the question, well, who would be allowed to publish in it? Which part of the real world would be allowed to survive in social media versus some other part? So I think the very discussion of social media is somehow separate from the real world. That's the actual problem. It's an unrealistic point of view. The minute you open up a platform for anyone to publish to, anyone will publish to it.
So you connect with an Al Jazeera piece that I actually sent you. Social media platforms swamped with fake news on the Israel-Hamas war. Al Jazeera, I think, is one of the, if there is a relatively unbiased platform, it's Al Jazeera, but that's another issue. A lot of complaints I read on social media saying we used to trust Twitter to get us the real news and now we don't. Are you saying then that, if it does mimic the real world, what's the point of going on it? You might as well be in the real world.
Well, it's the place that the real world meets each other. You're not going to meet everyone in the real world in your local town, but in Twitter, you literally see everything. And
it's cool with X now,
mimic might be too too engineered a word, Andrew. I think it reflects is probably the right balance. It reflects the real world because it doesn't alienate it. It allows it in.
And the Broderick piece I'm quoting is that he talks about dog shit content swirling inside of X. I mean, when you go on these platforms, no one's talking to one another. They're all hysterical. They're all articulating their own particular insanity, their own hysteria. I mean, I understand it's valuable if you want to post that hysteria, but what's the value for people actually reading it?
Well, the primary value is knowledge. I mean, part of knowledge is knowing what people think. And, to surface knowledge in real time, this is the first time in human history that could happen. Even printing presses typically took 24 hours to recycle. And by the way, we're full of fake news as well. I mean, press releases from governments that were republished from Reuters in the Times is a common occurrence. So, the fact is human beings contest reality, and they now have a very big canvas to contest it on.
You've talked about Twitter in the past, or X, as the town square. It's not as quite a civilized town square as some people might imagine.
Well, the town square isn't civilized. Why would you even want it to be?
Yeah, but if everyone's just screaming at one another, and I'm not sure what's the value here.
I don't think everyone is screaming. There are people who scream at each other, of course. But I don't think Twitter is only a place where people are screaming at each other. The things I read this week that were insightful, hundreds of tweets. So then I wouldn't have known about some of the things unless I was looking at Twitter. So the caricature of Twitter as a screaming match just isn't true.
Also, as has been the week, or one of the other issues of the week, is the EU are looking now at X over the distribution of misinformation. I'm guessing, Keith, that you're not a big fan of this EU investigation. Is it going to go anywhere? Are the Americans going to try and mimic the EU in investigating X?
Well, it's Big Brother, isn't it? It's 1984 or Big Brother. It's hey, we're the government, and we want you to only publish this kind of stuff. Well, sorry, you don't have any authority, and if you do, I'm not recognizing it.
Well, the EU has authority; they can shut it down. They can fine them. I mean,
they can't really shut it down. How are they going to do that?
Well, they can fine them, and
they could just pull out of Europe and publish from the US. I mean, honestly, the European government has almost no capability to control thought. And if it tries, it will become the bad guy.
Well, if I know you're not keen on the EU, you're also not keen. You managed, in spite of all the big events this week, you managed to find space for your favorite graduate student, Lina Khan. You had a connection with Lina Khan's FTT is totally outmatched versus Amazon. I'm not sure whether Lina Khan is gearing up for a fight with X, but she seems to be outmatched, Keith, by big tech, is she?
Yeah, I put that in mainly as a historical placeholder to affirm that the narrative we've discussed over the past 2 or 3 years is accurate, that she's out of her depth and trying to extend antitrust law to things it has no business to be in. One of the key points of that article is that 40% of Amazon's users are now shopping on a Chinese alternative. I forget what it's called now. It starts with the letter T, TELUS or something. So the idea that Amazon is any kind of a monopoly is the root problem. And for Lina Khan, anything big is a monopoly. But actually, she's wrong. It isn't.
Yeah, Lina Khan never seems to have met anything big that isn't, in at least according to Keith, in her mind, a monopoly. We'll have to get Lina on the show, Keith, because I know you and she would have a very civilized conversation. It's not just Israel and Hamas that's in crisis this week. It's also streaming services are struggling. What's happening with streaming services, Keith?
Well, this is a very thoughtful piece. You sent me this one as well, actually, Andrew. It really discusses the failing business models of some of the large networks that have gone into streaming, particularly Warner Brothers, but others as well. And when you read it, what for me comes out of it is that the streaming model requires high quality, regular content, not a back catalog. Disney has a great back catalog. So does Paramount Plus. So does Peacock. But people, I think, in the main, are looking for new content they haven't seen before, and that's dominated by Netflix, Apple TV Plus, a little bit Amazon Prime, and that's about it. So, in the streaming business model seems to challenge the old networks because they're not spending enough money on great new content regularly enough. What's happening is people are subscribing for a week, binge watching the small amount of new content, and then unsubscribing. So the idea that you get an annual subscription from a person isn't happening for the ones that are only relying on back catalog. That's my take. Others have got different explanations as to why it's the case, but I think it's really all to do with quality and volume of content.
Wouldn't be a week on That Was the Week without AI of the week. Interesting links. The one that really struck out to me was that OpenAI's revenue, this is on the information, that its revenue crossed 1.3 billion annualized rate. Is this a big deal, Keith?
Yes and no. The other news this week was that it's costing something like 700. I think I'm getting my facts right here. I'll fact check myself later, but I think it's $700 million a day to run OpenAI. They're losing money on every user, including the paying users. So 1.3 billion annual revenue doesn't really pay the bills. So they're still challenged to get to much larger numbers. There are rumors that they are going to try to raise upwards of $100 billion to fund it. I don't know if that's real.
Is that a smart move, do you think? I mean, what would the company then be valued at if they raised 100 billion?
Well, it'd be valued as a function of the appetite of the providers of the money for ownership.
No, I understand, but I mean, would it get valued at 300-400 billion?
Well, you've got to believe if Apple is worth nearly 3 trillion, and OpenAI really represents the future of the human race's knowledge network, it's going to be worth trillions. 100 billion is a tenth of a trillion. So it isn't totally unrealistic that it could raise that kind of money.
I understand, but I'm curious. Google's valued at 1.7 trillion. Apple, you say, almost 3 trillion. I don't know. Microsoft, I think, it is above 2 trillion. What kind of valuation do you think they can get away with? I mean, it's all speculative, as you suggested. It all depends on what the appetite of the investors. But could OpenAI theoretically be valued at $1 trillion? And wouldn't that be a record as a startup? What startup has ever, pre-IPO startup has ever been valued at $1 trillion?
Yeah, I mean, it is breaking records every time it does anything in terms of growth and value. No one's gotten to 1.3 billion of annualized revenue as fast as this either. I think $1 trillion valuation would be actually quite small.
Would you invest at $1 trillion?
I think if you invested at $1 trillion, you'd probably make 5 times your money in 5 years.
So you mean, in other words, it would be worth 5 trillion in 5 years?
Yeah, it's going to be the most valuable company on the planet by a large degree because there's no other game in town for the future of human knowledge management. And
wow, okay, that is I'm going to come back to you on that one. So you're dismissing Microsoft and Google?
Well, Microsoft relies on OpenAI, and Google is a weak competitor to OpenAI with a legacy business it can't close down. So I think OpenAI holds all the cards.
Wow. So it is a good investment then. At $100 trillion investment would be a smart move.
Well, put it this way, you'd be betting on OpenAI being the equivalent of the next internet. It's not just one company, it's the whole infrastructure of knowledge management.
Wow.
And remember that goes out now into agents and assistants, digital assistants.
But it also, no, I take your point, but it also assumes that OpenAI is the clear winner. You said, I'm quoting you, said the most valuable company on the planet. I mean, it does have competitors, and it hasn't really, as you suggested, it hasn't really proven itself. It's not even profitable.
Well, it shouldn't be profitable. Firstly, that would be a mistake because it's still investing in its platform. So as long as people will give it money to invest, it should want to invest it, not to keep it. And clearly, the revenue traction shows that it's just scratching the surface. If it can get to 1.3 billion in 12 months, what's to say it can't get to 10 billion in another 10 months?
And is that 1.3 billion? Is that mostly people paying $20?
No. Actually, that's a very small part of it. It's mainly API use by enterprise users and other companies.
Astonishing. We need new language, Keith. You used to always, in the old days, talk about unicorns. Now we need a word to describe trillion-dollar pre-IPO startups, don't we?
Well, there aren't going to be many of them. I mean, if somebody can figure out nuclear fusion, they probably would become one. But there aren't going to be many companies. I think the internet can now create unicorns very easily. Anything successful, you know, it occurred to me this week that even in a single city, a big city, food delivery alone can create a unicorn that only serves a single city because the revenues associated with being good at that are very large. And the margins are not so large, but, you know,
So unicorns are boring now. They're run of the mill. We see them all over the place. What's interesting are post unicorns, these trillion-dollar private companies that we don't even have it. We're so early on this, we don't even have a word for it. You need to tell Genet to come up with a word to describe these people.
Yeah, it's a centicorn is basically 100 billion.
Centicorn. Well, that's Keith's shot. And then meanwhile, you also have an interesting piece from Noema, which is an interesting platform, sort of a magazine startup, about artificial general intelligence already being here. What do they say that's different? I mean, this is an endless debate. Gary Marcus and many other AI experts have strong feelings on this front.
Yeah, they're making the point that ChatGPT is so good at so many things, as long as you know how to use it, that it already is artificial general intelligence. So the debate about whether AGI is possible is over. It is, and they've already built it. You know, I think there's a semantic issue that Gary Marcus would focus in on, which is that there's a difference between being able to answer questions on anything and be somewhat accurate versus being able to think and reason. And so he defines AGI as thinking and reasoning, which clearly ChatGPT doesn't do. It's a statistical machine, basically, a very large-scale statistical machine. Words and numbers for ChatGPT, an association between numbers, the distance between words is the distance between numbers. So it's a number machine. And therefore, he would say it can't be AGI because it doesn't reason. What Neoma is saying is it is AGI because it can do everything, even though it isn't reasoning. And I think they're both kind of right. I wouldn't pick between those two. They're just different end games, looking at the starting point in different ways. I think everyone has to acknowledge that ChatGPT is stupendous compared to, I mean, imagine the time before ChatGPT and somebody would have described it. We wouldn't have believed it, would we?
Well, I'm not particularly, I don't use it, so I don't know. It hasn't changed my life, but we will see. Certainly, it's a remarkable company. A few weeks ago, Keith, we talked about a certain Sam Bankman-Fried. You said, well, this guy is proven. We need to prove him guilty before we decide his fate, determine his fate. Now he's had his time, or certainly some of his accusers have their time in court. You connect with some pieces, one from the information on SBF didn't understand risk reward, which is a euphemism for describing that he's basically a big time crook. And you also connect with a piece in The Verge asking why and how it's still getting worse for Sam Bankman-Fried. Have you made, is he guilty, Keith, from this week's court case? Does it reveal the fact that this guy's going to end up spending the rest of his life in jail like Bernie Madoff?
Well, yeah, my desire for an actual prosecution has been fulfilled. The prosecution is still in control of the case right now. And by all accounts, the cross-examination from his defense has been poor. And the accusation...
Well, maybe there's no defense. That's why it's been poor.
That could easily be the case. That's one possible reason. The overriding impression from this stage of the trial is not only is he guilty, that he was consciously manipulating customer money and making his colleagues help him do that. Now, the one thing you should always say is let's let the defense form their defense. Let's hear from him. But I think there's a very steep hill for him to climb to get to a point where you doubt his guilt now. And this is what we needed. We need a trial, not media speculation, and we've gotten it. And yes, I never thought he was innocent. I just thought he should be given the right to prove his innocence. And he still hasn't, by the way. That still has to happen. And let's see.
Any thoughts on Caroline Ellison and her role in all this? The fact that she was his girlfriend, his closest associate at the company, made her CEO or president, paid her large amounts of money, and now she's ratting on him.
Well, there's a tragic human story in there, isn't there? But I also think that the conflict of interest is important to keep in the back of one's mind. I mean, the government has taken all of his relationships and promised them let's say, at least mitigated treatment in their own trials if they give evidence against him. And in her testimony, she's using words like, we did criminal things, which may be true, but she's no lawyer or judge, so she probably isn't aware of whether they're criminal or not. And I think, for that reason, I don't doubt anything she's saying. I do doubt her motivations and her formulations as being, let's call it, free thinking. And we'll see. I suspect he's going to go to prison for a very long time. We'll know more over the next week or two, and let's keep talking about it.
And you're in Palo Alto, in the heart of Palo Alto, all your friends are Palo Alto, Stanford people. Is there and I've asked you this before and you've always dodged the question, is there a broader moral parable here about his justification in terms of effective altruism and all the rest of his garbage?
Well, he's a pretty unique individual.
He's not that unique. I mean, effective altruism is something that his mother and his father peddled, and that gets peddled in all these universities.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Most of Silicon Valley doesn't talk about altruism, period, and effective altruism, not at all. However, his generation prides itself on, demonstrating humanity, let's say, through thought and ideas. Some people call it woke. And he blends the desire for money with that narrative, which now starts to look, highly suspicious. And I don't think you'll find many people in Silicon Valley that have both of those elements going on.
So you think there's a generational quality to SBF, that he reflects somehow the desire of young people to be both good and wealthy? That's a Silicon Valley indulgence.
Yeah,
Whenever
I
there was
mean,
one.
to be honest, most of us in the Valley who are involved in startup life don't like people who are obsessed by money. And it's quite rare for people who are focused on money to actually make money because the ecosystem rejects them. They're like a poisoned organism. The ecosystem really is looking for people who want to change the world. And they believe they'll make money if they do that. But money isn't the goal. Changing the world is the goal. And you'll see that you can be cynical about it, but I think it's common to pretty much every startup entrepreneur. Even Travis Kalanick, who's an extreme individualistic kind of a guy, was really set on changing the world before he thought about making money. And for a long time, it didn't look as if he would make money. So I think Bankman-Fried's desire to make money, a little bit like Elizabeth Holmes, means that he's rejected by the organism. If you look at his investors, typical seed and A-round investors didn't invest in FTX. It was unusual investors, later stage investors, if you will. So I wouldn't tarnish Silicon Valley with Elizabeth Holmes or Bankman-Fried, to be honest. I think the Valley is different to both of them.
Someone needs to write a book, Keith, A Tale of Two Sams, comparison and contrast Sam Bankman-Fried and Sam Altman.
Yeah,
maybe we can,
maybe
you and I can co-author that one. It's time for Startup of the Week, and an interesting startup this week, Adobe. We don't think of them so much in the startup space, but they're a very innovative company, changing the world. What are Adobe up to? How did they get Startup of the Week this week?
They announced the next version of their AI tools, and the way they're doing it is they have a thing called Firefly, which is their AI core, but they're building it into Photoshop, Adobe Premiere, and now Adobe Illustrator. So previously, to use Illustrator, which is a vector graphics program, so it really is for highly skilled visual designers with fonts and objects and shapes. They've made it so that you can ask Illustrator to build something for you, and apparently does a very good job of building a layered vector graphic of whatever it is you describe to it, and then you can tweak it and edit it. So it's further example of reducing human labor time by applying AI to creative tasks in this case. And Adobe is at the very beginning of this, which is why it qualifies for Startup of the Week.
Right, I'm waiting for Adobe. I mean, I use some of their photo and video stuff. I'm waiting for an integration of AI. I'm sure it will come. Finally, the X of the week. Let's go back to where we started. Ray Dalio, David Sachs quoting him here. Dalio writes on X, the odds of transitioning from the contained conflicts to a more uncontained hot world war that includes the major powers has risen from 35% to about 50% over the last 2 years. God knows how he comes up with those numbers. Tell me more about this, Keith.
Well, I just put it in to highlight and illustrate why I wrote the editorial I wrote, because it's a kind of an unusual editorial for me. And I wrote it because that's where the conversation is going. And I think the minute that smart people think that world war is inevitable is the beginning of a bad phase in human history. And in my editorial, I wanted to say, we have the ability to say no to that and do something about it, which starts at home with advising our leadership not to engage in a war with China, but to embrace the economics of doing business with China. And in doing so, acknowledge that America may become number two instead of number one, and that's not a big problem. The X of the week is evidence that we need to have that conversation, because if we don't, David Sachs's of this world and Ray Dalio's of this world and Graham Allison's of this world and Noah Smith's of this world will dominate the conversation. And the end game there is the brutality we saw in Israel last week writ large on the world scale.
Well, it's not just this week, it's as we speak.
Yeah.
I'm lucky I don't do the newsletter, Keith, because if I had, I would have made Hamas startup of the week, but I would have gotten into trouble for that one, wouldn't I?
Well, I think you get away with a lot because you're actually Jewish and therefore can take a position on things that those of us who are not Jewish would find it hard to do.